Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. Today I want to talk about a methodology for Old Testament textual criticism. One of the things that we'll be working on in class is learning to work with the textual apparatus at the bottom of our BHS texts. I want to give a little bibliography for text criticism. The best scholarly treatment still is by Emmanuel Tove, his textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, but also the text that we're currently using in class, Paul Wegner's A Student Guide to Textual Criticism of the Bible, Its History, Methods, and Results. And in particular, we'll be looking at pages 120 to 139, which is chapter 5, determining the most plausible original reading. So I invite you to make sure you've taken a look at that before you listen to the lecture. Another older text, this is the English translation from 1979. The actual German original was from earlier. And then it's also handy to make sure that you have access to a simplified guide to BHS, because one of the issues that you encounter when you're doing text criticism is all of the different abbreviations that are used in the text critical notes of the BHS text. Now the same material is in the back of, or actually in the front of the BHS text, but many of the abbreviations are explained in Latin. So Scott's book is a helpful guide that gives you the meanings in English. Now, the steps for text criticism essentially involve making sure you have access to a critical edition, and I've listed both BHS and BHQ. The BHQ is currently in preparation. You can buy Deuteronomy in the BHQ, and by the way, the Q stands for number 5, so it's going to be the 5th edition of the Hebrew critical text. It's an exciting edition because it's going to be closer to an eclectic text, sort of like the New Testament, but it's only completed at this point in fragments. And if you go on and try to buy, just say, the book of Deuteronomy, it's extraordinarily expensive right now, like $80 just for Deuteronomy. So I would suggest that you just stick with BHS for now. And what you want to do is when you're reading through the Hebrew Bible, you want to explore the textual apparatus for variant readings. And text critical notes will be embedded in the BHS text with little English lowercase letters in superscript, which I'll show you in just a couple of minutes. Then you want to evaluate both the internal and the external evidence. And what I mean by that, by the internal evidence, it's actually the context itself. Textual criticism is both an art and a science. It involves making judgments. It involves, in some ways, common sense, but it involves actually being able to discern an actual issue in the text. And again, one of the issues with Old Testament text criticism is simply the paucity of available manuscripts that show variance. And so sometimes scholars will find problems in the text that are simply due to readability issues, and then essentially a scholar has to make a hypothesis about a potential solution to what they perceive as a problem. For this class, we're going to focus essentially on using the BHS apparatus, and we'll discern in terms of the internal evidence, does this text, what's the best reading for the context, and we'll also use the external evidence of the variants that are listed in BHS to make our decisions. I encourage you to watch the other lecture that I've given on textual criticism for information about the various sources. So by external evidence, we mean texts outside of the Masoretic tradition, including texts from Qumran, some of the medieval Masoretic manuscripts, also the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and from other things that are cited in the apparatus like Targums, other translations. And through that process, we want to seek to determine the most likely reading. Now, it is true that sometimes scholars will conjecture a reading, and you'll see that in some places in BHS where they make a suggestion really without clear evidence. Maybe they're trying to reconstruct on the basis of what the Septuagint is, and they hypothesize the Hebrew text, or in a few places they just offer a reading based on their best judgment. At this stage in our learning for this class, I'm going to discourage conjectures unless you find one that you think has support in our BHS apparatus. Again, for all of this, make sure you take a look at the method chapter in A Student's Guide to Textual Criticism of the Bible by Paul Wegner, pages 120 to 139. Now, at this point, I'm going to switch over to the Hebrew text. And so I encourage you to open up the book of Deuteronomy, and we're going to look at a couple of verses right at the end of chapter 4, beginning with Deuteronomy 4, verse 44. So go ahead and switch or open up your Bible and prepare to read along with me. All right, I'm going to be using accordance. And accordance has a tagged version of the BHS, and I was able to blow it up so you can see it pretty well. And I want to show you a couple of things. First of all the little letters that you see here, these are the superscripted letters. These are the text critical notes. So whenever you see a letter in a superscript on a word, that tells you to drop your eyes down to the bottom of your BHS text. Or in my case, I can go ahead and look over here at the apparatus, but this is the same as what you would have at the bottom of your page in BHS. Again, if you're in the BHS, it would be page 294 where I am. So let's go ahead and look at this. Okay, so when we read through this, and I'll highlight the words and go through here, and this is HaTorah, the law, which Moses put before the sons of Israel. Again, that's a fairly straightforward verse, and I hope you're able to go ahead and read along. Maybe the trickiest part about translating this would be to recognize this as a middle weak verb, but what we have here is a perfect third masculine singular from seem, and with Moses as the subject there. And we do have one text critical note on vazot. And if we go over and look at it, we have a couple of notes here. And notice this, MSS means manuscripts. This is referring to medieval manuscripts. So 2 medieval manuscripts, along with this is the symbol for the Septuagint. This is the symbol for the Syriac version. I'm able to just click on here, but your simplified guide to BHS or the back of the BHS would have this as well. So let's go back to here. But the S would be the Syriac, and the V is going to be the Vulgate. So the Latin Vulgate. And so what this variant is suggesting, note, is this. Instead of having vazot, it's just zot. And so in these particular traditions, and note what we have here are just a couple of Hebrew manuscripts, and then we have the translations, the Septuagint, the Syriac, and the Vulgate, all witness to potentially just the word zot. Now this gets down to, would you change the text on the basis of this? Probably not. The internal evidence, it is readable as it is. Perhaps the Vav is introducing a new idea here. And if you go back and remember one of the key principles is, which of the variants can best explain the other ones? And in a sense, the Vav being on here easily explains its omission, but you would wonder, why would you necessarily add a Vav if you didn't have one here already? And so we will go ahead and leave the text alone there. So essentially what I want you to do when we talk about a text critical assignment is just walk through and explain the text critical apparatus, translate it, and if you're going to make a change, make an argument why you would do that. Let's go on to verse 45. Ele, these, and again, this puts it in predicate position. We don't have the definite article, so it's these are the testimony or testimonies, the statutes, and the judgments which Moses spoke to the sons of Israel when they came out from Egypt. Again, in terms of difficult words to perhaps parse, maybe this one is the most difficult. What this is a infinitive, or in Arnold Choi's vocabulary, this would be the infinitive construct. It has a preposition on it, and it has the third masculine plural suffix on it. We have a baus tav. This is an infinitive from yatsa, meaning to go out. Oftentimes, when you have an infinitive construct with a bait, you want to add the idea of when. This is a temporal phrase, and then the suffix sort of becomes the subject. When they came out, min Mitzrayim, from Egypt. Okay, let's go back and look at the two text critical issues that we encounter here. What we have is, here we want to go to A, and there's a question mark here because this word, this for testimony, and if you do a quick look at the lexical form here, and I'm just going to open up the instant detail. You can look this up in Brown Driver Briggs or Holiday or the lexicon that you have. Notice that you have the singular form and then the plural is a doot. And so the question ends up being here, what is the translation? Is this just the testimony, or is it the testimonies? And we notice we have all these other words are plural. And so the text critical apparatus, the L here is again, abbreviation from a Latin word lege, which means read. You're suggesting read the testimonies. And you're suggesting that you compare the Septuagint, which has ta marturia, which is the witnesses of the testimonies, along with some other evidence. So the editor is suggesting that, with some question mark, that you would go ahead and read this as a plural. Again, this could simply be in the Masoretic tradition. This word could have been written defectively. This could have been a kibbutz there instead, and that would have given you the ha'adut. And so they're suggesting that you would change to go ahead and read this with the support of the Septuagint. Now, the second variant that we have here is based on, this is a reference to some older edition of some medieval Hebrew manuscripts. And then it says a few medieval additional manuscripts, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and what they're doing, notice, instead of having the Vav on the front, it just begins with the Hey. Again, looking at the context, we do note that we have a series of nouns. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to have the Vav, but it seems to make sense in the context here, and so there's really no reason to change the Masoretic text, as it works pretty well in this context. And there's essentially limited support. We just have a few medieval manuscripts and the Samaritan Pentateuch. All right, let's look at the last variant, which is on Yisrael. And so we go over here to look at it, and let's take a look. Going over here, we have the Septuagint, and notice the negative. B is the Vaticanus manuscript of the Septuagint, and then there's a few other minuscule editions of the Septuagint that add, or minus a few of these, add the word in te eremo. This means in the wilderness. Okay, and so in other words, there's an addition here. So in a few versions of the Septuagint, but not all, there is the addition of in the wilderness. And so to the sons of Israel when they came out from Egypt. So some of these versions would have to the sons of Israel in the wilderness when they came out from Egypt. And also, they're also saying, take a look at some of these other verses, suggesting that if you look at the Septuagint for these other ones, you would see these verses. All right, let's look at the last one. The C, we have the Septuagint, and then the B has to do with the Sinaiticus version of the Septuagint, and a few minuscules. There's an addition of in te eremo. and they're rooting that in how those texts also read chapter 6, verse 3, and chapter 8, verse 3. Again, there's no need to amend the Hebrew text based on that. We would go with the Masoretic text here, but you do want to note what this means. Okay, that gives you a little idea about what we're going to do in class. So one of the things you need to do between now and when we have our intensive is to get a feel for the apparatus. We'll work through it in class. You can ask questions about the meaning of different elements in the class. We'll go into a little more detail. And one of the things you'll be doing on your final project is doing a full text critical analysis of the text that you work on, explaining the variants and simply citing whether or not you would be amending the Masoretic text. Okay, if you have questions, let me know. Looking forward to working with you. I'm Brian Russell. Thank you for listening.